Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you back to our conference. The upcoming session is the third one. It's about divisions, and it will be chaired by Miroslav Michala of the Charles University, who also was a kind member of the program committee. So thank you, Miroslav, and may you please introduce yourself and the panel.
Thank you. I will take the opportunity of organizers, and I will speak in Slovak. I'm sorry for that. If there are any problems, I will try to tell it in English. At first, I would like to... Ako prvé, ja by som vás chcel privítať na dnešnom poobednom paneli, ktorý bude rozvádzať vlastne teoretické otázky, ktoré sme v prvých dvoch paneloch riešili. Teraz by sme sa mali dostať do školy, do učebne, dostať k učebným osnovám a analyzovať vlastne, akým spôsobom môže byť etnicita alebo národná politika účastná vyučovania dejepisu. Predtým, ako by sme začali, by som ale chcel privítať dve výnimočné dámy. Pani Sirku Ahonen, ktorá bude vlastne keynote speakerkou nášho bloku a bude hovoriť o veľkých príbehoch, o veľkých rozprávaniach, a spolu s ňou aj jeho excelenciu Helenu Turi, veľvyslankyňu Fínska v Českej republike, ktorá nastúpila do úradu v auguste 2014. Teraz mi dovolte, aby som predstavil našu hlavnú rečníčku, Sirku Ahonen, ktorá prichádza z univerzity v Helsinkách a je samozrejme známa akademička, ktorá má na konte viacero kníh. Jej posledná knižka sa týka vlastne vyrovnávaniu sa s minulosťou, vyrovnávaniu sa s ťažkou minulosťou, tmavou minulosťou, ktorá je stále, myslím si, v strednej Európe alebo v postsocialistickej Európe predstavuje veľkú tému verejných aj akademických debát. Dovoľte teda, aby som pani profesorke dal slovo.
Dear colleagues, the night before flying to Prague, I watched in my TV an American production, Manifest Destiny, as I realized that I will have an opportunity to be acquainted with a new grand national narrative. It was a narrative of white settlers who were endowed by God with this mission to take, civilize and cultivate North America. But alas, the journalists who had produced the program and the historians who appeared there, they were eroding the beautiful grand narrative. That has happened with the classical grand narratives, the golden age of which was 19th century. Okay. I'm sure we all know them, even if today history books are no more based on these grand narratives. The first was the narrative of nation state, according to which a nation, any nation, always existed. It just took its time to evolve into a nation state. Liberty, the grand narrative of liberty, It ran from Athenian city-states to Magna Carta, French Revolution, and at 1900 or so, people, I think in Europe, generally believe that the triumph of freedom will just go on. Class struggle, you might know that. It was a story, a great grand narrative of societies developing from slave stage, feudal stage, bourgeois stage to communist society, and that would be the end of history. But as has happened with this manifest destiny, all these grand narratives, they have eroded in the course of 20th century. Nation state, the grand narrative lost its power in the disaster of Second World War. The grand narrative of freedom had already lost its credibility when, in fact, most European states after First World War turned into authoritarian, totalitarian regimes. Class struggle, the story, the grand story, collapsed in 1989. So, but still, these narratives have a certain appeal, especially to political leaders who find that a people with unified minds is easier to govern than those who would be sharing different identities and also pursue perhaps different goals in history. So we have political leaders, I might later refer to some of them, who urge national grand narratives to be restored in history education. They have been very critical when history educators have turned to critical skills and given up grand narratives. The problem with the grand narratives, of course, is that they are exclusive. They always exclude from this grand development minorities, weak groups in the society. So that's why grand narratives hardly are something to be, are things to be advocated anymore. But before going to do my alternative to grand narratives, I will tell you what I think of history. What is history? Yeah. When I studied history, I'm a very old person, we still lived in a positivist era. History was supposed to be hard facts, and historians were supposed to find and reconstruct the past on the basis of hard facts. It was only when I then moved to history education. I taught history for a while in school, and then I worked for most of my life in teacher education. So I realized that history is more than just these hard scholarly produced facts that are then diluted to school books. History is a life vital phenomenon. We have historical consciousness. That means we have this ability to rewind time backward and forward. We think of our future and project the aspirations to questions concerning the past, and the past also, it guides our choices concerning the future. So history is life relevant for people to orientate to their individual and lives and to their life of their society. So, no more just academic history for me. My change of mind was supported by changes in historiography. History was, by the theorists of history, defined no more as a reconstruction of the past, but a construction by historians. A construction which did not have this absolute truth value. Constructions would be changing, like also already on the basis of this historical consciousness. It was Hayden White who went as far as saying that all history is just artifacts. History is as literary, historical literature, no more true. Anyway, it was Frank Ankersmith, a Dutch philosopher of history, who then found a kind of middle way. He says that history consists of evidential, of referential statements that are based on evidence. But then, secondly, and mostly on narrative substances. These referential statements, they become narrative substances, narratives, when historians attribute meaning to the facts. And historians connect cause and effect. They are bound to attribute meaning to events and phenomena. Okay. Supported by my professional aspirations and by historiographical developments, I then came to the definition of history. You see, I see history as three fields that interact with each other, definitely. Historians, they are also part of the social memory of their community, and they can't decide, for instance, what they will research without social memory telling them what's relevant, what's not. Academic historians very often are interested in affecting public memory, which to me are these cultural reifications of history, from museums and monuments to commemoration rituals, historical fictions, and all that. We had in the morning quite interesting comments on these terms, public history, social memory. Though I like these terms. I prefer them to, for instance, Jan Assmann's communicative memory, because I like this hint to the idea that there is, after all, a society shares history. And I like public memory. I prefer that to cultural memory, as it contains this element of official history, or this domain. If society is authoritarian, so there tends to be something called official history, and then it's present in public history. History education also, I include that into public memory. What is common to both public memory and social memory is their narrative form. Narrative form, we know it from literature. It's pleasant. There's a plot in a narrative, and there's very often an exciting contrast between good and evil that makes a narrative dynamic. So no wonder social memory is when ordinary people mediate their memories, it's stories. And now we come to the problem, or a kind of strength of those stories. They are about good and bad. There's a moral element in those narratives people tell each other. I have an example from a novel. Here, a Swedish author, Mikael Niemi, tells of a father, a very rural father in northern Sweden, who tells his boy, his son, about what is important to take into account from the past. This happens in the 1960s. The father tells, "There are two families in this district that have caused us a lot of harm, and you are going to have to hate them forever and a day. In one case, it all goes back to a perjury suit in 1929, and in the other, it's got to do with some grazing rights that a neighbor cheated your granddad's father out of in 1902. And both these injustices have to be avenged at all costs, whenever you get the chance. And you must keep going until them bastards have confessed and paid, and also gone down on their bare knees to beg for forgiveness." Do you recognize talk between politicians on behalf of their state and making claims on their neighbors? That's history, morals. I will show a journalist use of or presentation of morals or history narratives. This is from Bosnia in the war in 1993. Here we see a kind of Second World War soldier who fights as he wants to avenge something that happens to his brother-in-law in First World War. And then we see a warrior from 1990s who wants to avenge what happened to, his cousin again, in Second World War. And then we have this little baby who is thinking of avenging what happened to his father in 1990s. This is not, having really done research into the use of history in Bosnia, I don't agree that the war of 1990s would be based on social memory. But there was use for social memory during that war. That's very true. Okay. When I studied what happened in Bosnia, and then I also compared that to South Africa and so on, I realized that these moral grand narratives are so strong as they are based on impressive arch myths, many of them from Bible. They are from history of the Israeli people. You must recognize stories and these Israeli stories have then been copied, utilized by many different countries. There's a story of unjust treatment, God promised land, God elected people. And then when we come to some, it's more modern myths, it's Holocaust, the term as it was spread since 1980s, and was bolstered through very rich history culture around it. It became useful for many societies, social groups, ethnic groups in their predicament. One can today see that nearly any mass murder is called genocide. Resistance, Second World War, it became such a beautiful attribute to one that, for instance, in Denmark, my colleague has studied that in memories there are many, let's say, people in my age who tell about being members of resistance, even if they were not. So, this, I was, in my study, I was quite impressed or, in fact, worried about how symmetrically these myths were used by these warring parties in Bosnian war. All Serbs, Croats, Muslims, all regarded themselves as victims of unjust treatment. Atrocities, very similar, identical atrocities were described by all of them. Genocide, the only group that, as far as I have read, listened to them, who did not consider herself a victim of genocide, were the Croats. Redemption, one of these classical myths, it was expected, and it's still expected by all these groups, as they did not really achieve what they wanted. The redemption they wanted in 1990s. So that I think it's these myths of guilt and victimization and their mythical loading that keeps the conflict, I would say, still alive in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is really sad. In order for these symmetrical, mythical stories to be not to be used against each other, one needs, and now I come to history education, one needs a dialogue in history classroom. It's the only way. If one just goes from vertically telling about our unjust treatment, atrocities we suffered, genocide, whatever, and so on, then it's automatically the other two groups are your adversaries. So in order to see that what these adverse groups share, the suffering, the frustration of not achieving what society really wants. In order to avoid that, we need really dialogical history classes. And I really crystallize the characteristics of a dialogical history class into three things. Social memory and big history need to be integrated in history classroom. My Danish colleague has done a kind of experiment, a project on that. He let his teacher students, he started with teacher students for them to then go to school and do the same thing. He asked them to collect family memories and then bring them to the seminar, and then they were elaborated, and in order to see that after all one did not need to be an active resistance hero to have a kind of feeling that I was my parents, my grandparents were important in surviving the war. We need social inclusion of narratives. Yeah, very soon. That's an old idea of narrative. This should be now changed to school class, and that's the social inclusion. Many modern textbooks in Europe now look like this. There are documents and abstracts from historians' texts that can be really speak against each other, and that's dialogical history. And then we need the real critical skills, deconstruction of the myths. That's obvious. For European and Central European history educators, I'm wary of two things and would like this to be discussed. What to do with history politics. I have examples from Russia, from Hungary, at least, where politicians urge historians to be nationalistically biased. So I have examples of history teachers resisting that. Nation. There was a definition of nation by Ernst Renan in the 1880s. He said that he opposed the Central European Blut and Boden, this ethnic idea of nation, and advocated an idea that nation is a society where people share equal rights and duties. So that's to be considered as the way of teaching history of a nation. So, thanks.
Thank you. I think the integration of the social memory and big history or grand narrative is a really hard task, I think, and really actual in Central European historiographies. There are really big discussions about how to deal with the past or some issues from the past, and I hope that might be one of the idea for the next discussion. Now I would like to introduce our guest from Ukraine, Oksana Mishlovska. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Genoa, and her research is dealing with the question of post-Soviet legacies. She's working with the topic of nationalization of history and historical narratives about Ukrainian past. Please.
Thank you very much, Miroslav, for the introduction. I would like to start by thanking the organizers. For me, it has been already a very rewarding experience, and even seeing that developed countries, which we consider developed as Canada, Germany, the UK, they struggle absolutely with the same issues as we do in Ukraine or some of these countries which recently become independent. It already shows how helpful such a conference can be in sharing notes and seeing that we actually face many similar issues. What I'm going to talk in 15 minutes that I have, it's about one very controversial, difficult issues in history narratives in Ukraine, which concerns two nationalistic organizations. One is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and how they are being depicted in official discourse. Mainly discourse which is formulated by the Ministry of Education and what we consider institutions, as it was mentioned in the UK case. And secondly, a second big thing that I'm going to talk about, it's about how this issue is being depicted in history textbooks. And finally, I'm going to talk about focus groups with history teachers, how teachers make sense with these textbooks which are imposed kind of by the state. Just acknowledgement, this project has been already going on for 3 years. It's been funded by the Swiss National Fund on regionalism on Ukraine, and as you can imagine, that has been very topical issues where we, with our project starting 3 years ago, we are right on in line with what is currently going on in Ukraine. I'm going to position what I'm going to talk about in broad terms about fundamental issues. Some of these have already been discussed, and I think it's really important to ask these questions before going into details and discussing what actually OUN, OPA, and narratives are about. First question is about what is the focus of history narratives. Even in general, already several people talked about this. As we see in Ukrainian history textbooks, the core overarching theme is political and military history, and that is history of statehood, of Ukrainian statehood. The second question is about, in general, what is the role of school history education in general, and we will see, I will present to you how it is being understood both by state officials, by teachers, and those who write history textbooks. One is about liberal education, and we already discussed some of the construction, some possible practical ways of approaching how do you teach these complex issues at school. Second is about educating a loyal citizenship, and we see there is a lot of this in Ukrainian textbook. Another one is about loyalty to the nation and to the state. That's another dimension which I say this is officially defined purpose of teaching history. The next big question is about the role of the state, and that's, we cannot go around. There's lots of questions we are discussing here, but still going back, it's still like a necessary evil, because if we decided to live in a kind of a bounded state, that we still need something which the state is doing for us as a third-party enforcer, but at the same time, there is lots of violation which takes place, especially vis-a-vis who are not part of the celebrated nations, sometimes ethnic nations, which is at the center of these narratives. And for Ukraine, a very relevant question right now in view of what is going on is regionalization of history. And Petro Poroshenko, in his inauguration speech, he promised that this will happen in Ukraine, that local communities will have the right to define their own narratives. And I will show how difficult it is, because we still, in Ukraine, we live with this dominant ethnic master narrative of what is defined, officially defined as an acceptable history narrative. In terms of methodology, for this project we analyzed all of the textbooks which have been published in the last 20 years, and that has been lots, like for this it had been 14 at least, and I will have to add some recent ones which were published in the last year. Second, it's analysis of the official documents, a kind of how does state define the official purpose of education, especially history education. And lastly, that's the most interesting, these have been the focus groups with history teachers in various regions of Ukraine, just to see how do they live with this official narrative which comes from the center, from Kyiv, and how do they have to explain these difficult, controversial issues to their pupils. These are just a list of the textbooks which I analyzed. The first thing I would like to talk, it's about Soviet legacies, and this is my core argument that still, even if we think that we have, there had been a time of rupture with the past, and every single thing written about kind of new Ukrainian state or with any of the post-Soviet republics will start with the collapse of the Soviet Union, so these presuppose there is a rupture. That's not the case. There is still, in terms of structures which we have, mentalities, we still have lots of Soviet legacies, and these Soviet legacies in terms of processes, they define largely how the process of teaching history at school is being organized. Just one very simple thing that teachers, history teachers, those are former teachers who taught Marxism-Leninism. So that was also automatic transfer. Those who taught Marxism-Leninism in the past automatically become history teachers of national history in Ukraine from school to university level. The second, it's some author called this master ethnic narrative, so it's a kind of Soviet legacy of just having one explanation of the past, which used to be ideologically driven with only one possible ideology, Marxism-Leninism. Now it has been replaced by one master narrative of an ethnic nation. Next one, it's central management of education. And in Ukraine, it's especially important issue, as I already mentioned, in view of today's conflict, the issue of regionalization and just limiting, allowing at least local communities the right to develop kind of alternative visions of the past in addition to the central one. It also concerns how teachers perceive their task, and you will see from the quotes I have from the focus groups, it's indeed they define like whatever comes from the center, we are fine. Like the center Kyiv asked us to teach this in Odessa, in Donetsk about UNUPA, about nationalistic interwar organizations. We have to teach this. This is what the state requires us to do. The last ones are separation between teaching and research. This is also one of very important legacies, Soviet legacies, where teaching is done at universities and research there are specifically kind of state-mandated institutions which do research, which is the Academy of Sciences and recently created the Ukrainian Institute of Memory. The most important point about these two, these are state-mandated. It's difficult to talk about independent research if these are funded by state institutions, which are mostly like official institutions which develop textbooks, do research, and so on. The next question I want to talk about is about national standards. That relates in general about the questions about the role of the state. So these standards control absolutely everything. This is from the issues which are covered in every single class to the number of hours and to absolutely objectives, methods of study. Is like a fully centrally controlled process. And as already I discovered through this conference, this is the case for many established states as well, where it's not something unique for post-Soviet states. And also there are quite a number of documents which I analyzed for this project which define these standards, which you call standards of education. This is just an example of this divergence between civic and ethnic in the documents, where on one hand you see that one standard would define like humanistic purpose of education, but at the same time another document will define that the purpose of education is to educate a loyal citizen of Ukraine and study like the national education about national idea and about the culture of the Ukrainian people. And here translation is important, narod, which in Ukrainian it means just an ethnic definition of the Ukrainian people, which immediately excludes all of the national minorities, where it becomes clear that the purpose of history is just puts this ethnic definition of a nation at the center of teaching of history. What we talk about nationalization of this narrative by putting this ethnic nation at the center of narrative, it's through that's the way how the textbooks authors, how the standards which define the purpose of history education, they see this attainment of Ukrainian statehood as something natural, and this is a theological objective which had to be achieved, and the purpose of history is to prove that there are stages in the development of Ukrainian statehood which allowed us finally in 1991 to attain this long-waited for statehood. These are just some of the quotes, I will not read them, just which show how authors themselves see their task as writing textbooks, history textbooks, where they concretely define that this is the only purpose of this textbook. It's to describe the establishment of the modern Ukrainian nation, which I said is often understand this because the term narod is used, which means ethnically defined people, which in itself means that this is how they define the purpose of history writing. Here I wanted to talk, we already touched in some other presentation about the political dimension, and in Ukraine that has reached just some such levels of politicization which are hardly difficult to imagine. Just here citing one decree by President Yushchenko that was his present to the Ukrainian nation before transition to Yanukovych, where he issued a decree where he officially defined what are the official stages in Ukrainian statehood and which are the military forces who officially fought for Ukrainian independence. These are the forces which really make sense, which already presented as a way better, more important, because they had the purpose of fighting for independence, which puts everything else, all alternative narratives, into a secondary place. I see I have 5 minutes, about controversial issue, now about OUN and OPA. These issues indeed extremely difficult, that I will not be talking about history as it's not the purpose of this presentation, but just some controversial issues. It's about ideology, about this nationalistic organization with association with fascism and some of the principles of fascism, collaboration with Nazi Germany, and most importantly the extermination, the participation of OUN-UNPA in extermination of Jews, Poles, even ethnic Ukrainians. And I have here just one phrase by one, I say modern historian who is studying and he's showcasing some of these difficult issues related to OUN-UNPA. How do we make sense with all of these difficult issues? How do we translate all of this into history narratives in textbooks? There's also another way how OUN-UNPA is presented, and in general the rationale that many have for introducing this into history narratives, just saying that OUN-UNPA as fighters for national independence, these allow us to kind of define ourselves as opposed to Ruski Mir, that doesn't matter that all of these crimes have been committed, because this is the only thing that we have in Ukrainian history which allows us to differentiate ourselves from Ruski Mir and a kind of another alternative vision of definition of national identity and teaching of history. So my core question is, why is that OUN-UNPA, which has mostly been based in Western Ukraine and has been really like process which started in interwar Poland, it has been nationalized. It became part of a national narrative about fight for independence. An argument is that by including, as of early 1990s, by using this criteria of fight for independence as the most important criteria in writing history, such controversial issues have been included, being whitened, where all of these controversial issues I showed you, they exist in very vague form or don't exist at all. They have been integrated into history narrative, especially school history narrative, without showing what is packaged inside these controversial issues which are packaged inside these organizations. So in what way, from the analysis we have done of all of these history textbooks, there are various approaches which may be not that different, how history authors, how history textbook authors, how they interpret these organizations. So mostly they either fully avoid saying these issues, they don't exist, so they just glorify saying these are the fighters for Ukrainian independence and everything. You can excuse absolutely all of the crimes, that this doesn't matter because the purpose justifies the means that they use. The second group, and this is majority of the books, it's ambiguous representation, where you kind of mentioned this was a nationalistic totalitarian organization, but they fought for independence, so it also kind of justifies that the means. And third group, which is a very small group, which are revisionist historians who at least start to question and try to see and discuss some of these difficult, controversial issues. But in general, what I have to say that this is a small minority of historians. And also, they don't have an answer to the question how to take out even this OUN-UPA narrative from history textbooks. I see you have 1 minute remaining. So now about teachers. In the minute I have remaining, we'll talk about focus groups. So how actually teachers live with that? They say if they receive textbooks from Kyiv, which officially have an ambiguous narrative where it says like these are the fighters for independence, bypassing all of these difficult issues. The one thing which came across almost all interviews, these focus groups interviews, they say, whatever, it comes from the center, we have to teach this. Like even if you think in Donetsk or in Odessa or in Simferopol, teachers usually would teach even if they fully disagree or it's against their family history and so on. This will not just some general difficulties with teaching history. I have quotes in Russian, in Ukrainian, because they are just really funny to read. This is just a direct reproduction. Sorry for those who cannot read in Russian, Ukrainian. I will make short summaries. I know already out of time, but these are just some of the quotes of how actually teachers approach when they have difficulty, they have questions saying that I have heard that UNUPA, they killed our neighbor, or they participated in these atrocities. What do you have to say, teacher, to this question? Another teacher from Donetsk saying that a relative of mine went to Western Ukraine in the 1940s. He was killed, but now everything is fine, that it's not a problem anymore. And other teachers would be saying that in the past we didn't know, for example, who Mazepa or UNUPA, who were these people, but now it's a kind of, we have different interpretations. In general, we don't have issues with any interpretations. What does mean in reality? Teachers fully avoid talking about the issue. Even pupils in class, when they raise these issues which are related to what they hear in family, what they read in news, because this becomes increasingly this discussion about atrocities committed, teachers say like this, read yourself, I'm not quite sure, there are different opinions on this. So this also means that teachers they're not prepared to confront some of these difficult issues, and they prefer to put this under the carpet and say, deal this in your own situation and decide yourself how to deal with the situation. So my conclusions, here are just some of the efforts which, in addition to the research we are doing, there are now quite a few efforts which try to question at least and find ways, alternative ways to thinking, how to rethink the way that history textbooks are written. And this is from a commission by distinguished historians who started to revise a kind of this ethnic national master narrative led by Natalia Yakovenko to a new generation of Ukrainian and foreign historians. And I showed you the quote by Per Anders Rudling, and he's, as you can imagine, a big friend of kind of fascist, pro-Russian fascist. His books are just being translated into Russian and distributed as brochures everywhere. And he, as you can imagine, a scholar is quite unhappy with that. Other efforts, there is also like Nova Doba. This is an effort which is funded by the Netherlands to integrate national minorities into narratives, but also it's a way of presenting different opinions. And we had the presentation from Canada. It's also the difficulty is if you just give a variety of different opinions, pupils absolutely lost. They don't know what to do if you have 10 different interpretations about the events. And my last question, my last point is about Poroshenko. Would he be able to deliver on his promise of regionalization of national history in Ukraine? So far, it is such a central issue, but it has disappeared with the war going on. As you can imagine, history narratives, it's not something which is a big priority. At the same time, the RNR and LNR leaders, they started already writing their own textbooks. That's already as of 1st of September, they created their own groups who say that this Ukrainian narrative doesn't make any sense, that we will have our own textbooks. In conclusions, my big question that I'm asking myself was this normalization of nationalistic narrative which took place. Like, how do we make sense, which is presented as a conventional approach to writing history, a conventional approach to construction of states, where it's normal to put this central issue, ethnic nation, at the center. The question is actually what can we do? And the few efforts which I present, I think it's just the very beginning. But already from the conference, it's just the beginning, and the end is not promising, because even other developed countries are struggling with lots of issues we have currently in Ukraine. So thank you. Sorry that Mr. Chairman, I took a bit more of time.
Thank you. I saw a lot of similarities. For example, in the case of Slovakia, there are really similar discussions on national history, and fight for national independence is one of the highest legacy of, for example, of the historians or some social actors which are dealing with history. It's I think really common for most of the post-socialist countries. Now I would like to introduce our colleague Uku Lember from Estonia, who is
PhD student in Central European University in Budapest, and his presentation, his speech will be based on a comparison of memories from Estonian and Russian language inhabitants or schools in late Soviet Estonia in 1916 till the 70s.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am looking at school a little bit from a side. My main work has been with intermarried couples and families in Estonia, and I'm doing long life story interviews with them, which often also touch upon school experiences. So for this presentation, I have tried to think more about what did school do for the socialization of these people, and I thank you for this opportunity. Now, first, let me share with you a little bit of the background for my speech, and then I will try to give you some more concrete examples as I deal with a discipline called oral history. We like to often emphasize specificities of individual life worlds, negotiations of belonging around that. Well, Soviet Estonian social world was divided really into Estonian and Russian worlds. And I will talk of the experiences of children from the intermarriages between Russians and Estonians in either Estonian or Russian schools. So for these children, often the school tipped, so to speak, the scales, either then setting them on the path of belonging to Estonian or Russian-speaking world. So I will look at how the school environment played a decisive role in their case, in their socialization, and I will also try to hint how and in which ways do school memories come up as ethnicized moments of belonging, where people from the intermarriages who are used to both Estonian and Russian languages and maybe memories suddenly are confronted with a mono-cultural understanding of things. I would also note, in terms of general information, that Russian-speaking population in Estonia increased from 5% in 1945 to 35% by the late 80s. So one can debate the causes for such influx of people and the level of resentment to the Soviet regime by the local Estonians, but it remains quite clear that the two population groups, by and large, had very different backgrounds in terms of interwar experiences and different attachments to the local space and the Soviet Union, not to speak of different languages and cultures. My project is based on 90 long life story interviews with people who came from intermarried families. And I have labeled these people so that one of them is Estonian-speaking local and the other one is Russian-speaking newcomer, with of course some caveat that this is just a very generalizing label. So these people lived what could be seen as the borderlands of two mentioned cultural traditions in Soviet and also in contemporary Estonia. But these borderland marriages comprised only 2 to 3% of total marriages in late socialism. And this shows, I guess, of quite big barriers between two worlds. And they tried to in different ways negotiating between different memory landscape, communicative and cultural memories found in these two different spaces. Needless to speak or say that my project is also motivated by the fact that Russian-speaking population today has very little representation in the Estonian public sphere, politics and historical representations. And my work is motivated by the will to bring some shades into the local nationalist historiography that has effectively silenced the voices of the Soviet-era immigrants, newcomers, with a Russian mother tongue. And of course, in the last year, I have had to not rethink, but I have had many problems to think, what does it mean to voice opinions that you physically resent? So because Ukrainian crisis has brought quite strong radicalization to the Estonian society, and I, as an Estonian, I have to, negotiate between willingness for plurality and understanding that I personally am not also able to tolerate all the opinions. So I would also like to note that I see these two worlds in Estonia as cultural worlds, which offered intermingled and plural distinct reservoirs of meaning, be they ethnic meanings, political or historical meanings, or past or future horizons. I want to say that they contain political and ethnic elements, but Estonian and Russian world were not political or ethnic worlds per se. So that they only contained elements that could be activated. For example, Russian world also contained references to many other ethnicities, to internationalism, to Soviet ideology, and so forth. And the Estonian world, even if being more ethnically homogeneous, it nevertheless contained generational and class-based diversity, things that national politicians often would not want to admit today. So this is my take on the social, maybe, that was also mentioned by the keynote speaker before. But indeed, the language barrier is quite divisive, and memories of key events such as the Second World War or the role of Soviet past are different. But if I look at how individuals then in oral history during the interviews connect with these two cultural worlds as I frame them, then I use the term identification instead of identity, in perhaps following Roger Brubaker's work, because I really don't see fixed identities coming through in 3-hour life story interviews. There are activated moments of belonging, there are passive moments of relating to some concept, there are unimportances as well. So I'm rather asking how human identifications were actualized depending on concrete people, contexts, and circumstances. How do people relate to dominant discourses, to the various ideas of what could be said as public identity entrepreneurs? This is how I would like to try to look at plurality within ethnicized, but not really ethnic worlds as well. Now, let's move to the schools. Russian language schools in Estonia were founded starting from the Second World War. In as much as they had existed before, they were totally eradicated with the process of eradicating the former Russian-speaking population by the Stalinist newcomers and nomenklatura especially. So since the late 40s until late 80s, there was a big difference in Estonian schooling experiences. The Russian schools followed all Soviet curricula. They were managed more or less directly by Moscow. Their teachers were taught primarily outside of Soviet Estonia, in other parts of the USSR. At the same time, the Estonian language schools had a localized curriculum. There were separate lessons on local language, literature, and geography. Since the 60s, the Estonian language general education was 1 year longer than a Russian one. It lasted for 11 years as opposed to 10 years in order to give more time for teaching the subject of local importance. So such was also the case in Latvia and Lithuania. So obviously, these two different paths were having very different students in these schools, and people from intermarriages based on this friendship and connections and the studies had different identifications. Often these people faced the question then at school, who am I? In relation to the peers who had very clear answers. So I would now try to propose some arguments about schooling in late Soviet Estonia based on my interviews, and then see how much time I will have for more specific examples. My generic finding is that Estonian language and Russian language schools worked in different ways for socializing children from intermarriages. Estonian schooling worked as a strong indicator for interethnic children to perceive later their primary belonging as Estonian. Children from Estonian schools have generally succeeded in life today of course, dependable manners, but they are confident in their cultural belonging today to Estonian world in Estonian Republic. In their stories, there are no tones of excuse or remorse, doubts about their being in Estonia. At the same time, Russian language schools did not achieve the same effect with ethnic belonging, either Estonian or Russian ethnic belonging. Intermarried children who went to Russian schools in Soviet Estonia have difficulties in placing themselves in ethnic terms. They are not willing to be Estonians, but they are often also not Russians. They are in between, but this is not comfortable. It is not comfortable in today's nationalizing memory climate, especially perhaps in an interview with an Estonian like me, but they also refer to their discomforts already back in socialism. I argue that this attests to the relative strengths of the Estonian cultural world in Soviet Estonia, strength that is often hidden in dominant discourses with references to occupation, suffering, and repression. I have one example in this regard, which is about what we call singing revolution, the late 80s, and singing it is because there were some great singings together where Estonians gathered at the song festival ground while showing their will to become nationally more and more independent while the Soviet Union was crumbling. So it happens that people who had been to Estonian school, either still being in the school or already graduated, have quite clear pattern of remembering this time clearly, having personal links to this period, and having positive memories of it. Students of Russian schools have much less of singing revolution in their life. And well, oral history allows to ask and to ask again. So I often came back to the issue of singing revolution, sometimes in some naive, way of like, oh, I as Estonian would like to hear more. Then I got some more stories, and mostly these stories were about family issues. Often one could find that grandfather was dying, or that there were material difficulties. So there is a lack of political reference, but there is also clearly lack of having socially participated. People didn't do it. And while the students were still in the Russian schools during the singing revolution, then it's pretty clear that they say that teachers wouldn't be touching upon the social issues at the time. So again, there is quite a clear pattern on the Estonian side and quite a lot of confusion with assigning cultural meanings in the Estonian case. Now, as I have a few more minutes, I would give you one example. And this is Lena Poska, who was born in 1953, and she lives today in Tartu. She has always lived in Tartu. Tartu is an Estonian city. There is only 10 to 15% of Russian speakers. Lena works in an Estonian group, and she spoke mostly Russian at home, and she went to Russian school. But she went to Estonian university initially because it was easier to get into Estonian group. Into a Russian group, it was much harder to get because people would apply to university from all over the Soviet Union to get into Russian group. So her memory is actually about, most interestingly, about how she went from Russian school to Estonian university. This was and I will quote her. There was a very big contrast. I came from a Russian school. I was all the time within a Russian company, and when I came to study with the Estonian group in 70s, then I was a stranger. I realized I was a stranger, but she cannot find words to somehow describe it, and we come back to it 3 times in the interview. And then she would say, up to now I cannot describe it because, well, even today you see there is a strong distinction, but I cannot describe it. But one first thing that struck me was, I realize now that while being older is a total foolishness, but well, that is also pretty polemical, maybe it's not. For example, with the pioneer movement, with the communist youth, there were all these real things I lived in and went through. I remember the pride that I had wearing a red scarf. Afterwards, the time of Komsomol, I really cried when I was not taken to Komsomol the first time because I had misbehaved somewhere. I had a genuine problem then. We, the ones who were in the communist youth, we were proud, really. We did not do anything wrong. We were just helping the old ones, collecting scrap metal and paper for recycling. What else did we do? And then among the Estonians, the attitude was different. And there it was that I realized that they had such a different attitude to it. And for me, it was the first time. Very many of them were not the members of communist youth organizations. And they were proud for not being. And I have never had friends from this group. Well, some acquaintances for sure. And now in hindsight, she's starting to make more sense of it, that maybe their relatives have suffered in the repressions and so on. So when Lena would speak about singing revolution, she would have a few mocking examples, but that would be it. Do I have still more time? Or? Okay. Right, so I have more stories about school, about singing revolution, and maybe a short one more. It's about Vaida, who lived in the same town, and she became 18 during the singing revolution, and she says the following: I graduated from high school, which means that this was the most splendid age. It was 1988. I'd say I was a grown-up person. There were quite many things allowed to me, and then there was the singing revolution, and our entire group, classmates who we were friends with, we went to the parties, we sang all these national songs, we went to all these events, to Tallinn, to huge night concerts. I did not even get into the university because of that. Nobody from our gang did. Everyone in Estonia held such a spirit. It was like that in the air, all that. And while telling this story, Vaida forgets that her mother didn't belong to this everyone. So while talking to me as an Estonian, we are on one mode of speaking about the past. When she would speak about her own family, she moves to different modes. So I wanted to give you some glimpses of how school and school socialization comes through in long life stories of people, but more importantly, I wanted to perhaps argue that Estonian school in Soviet Estonia was pretty Estonian-minded, whereas Russian school in Soviet Estonia left people confused. Thank you.
Now it's time for our last speaker of this panel. I would like to introduce Stefan Lavesk from University of Ottawa, who will speak about French Canadians, about national identity and historical consciousness, learning from the view of Franco-Ontarians. Thank you. Oh, I have to say one more thing. Stefan is a professor of history of education and director of the Virtual History and Stories Lab at University of Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks again for organizing this wonderful conference in this historically rich place. It's a privilege to be here today with you. Let me share with you some ideas about the kinds of things we're doing in Canada that potentially might have some interest for the kinds of things you are doing here as well. How fast can you make me literate? I want to rewrite history. Okay, let me begin with a little task for you. You'll be the king or the queen. Take a moment and tell me, in your own words, the history of your country, your nation, or your homeland as you see it. Then summarize your own historical account in one phrase or in one tweet. Well, that's the task that we put before some French Canadian and beginning teachers in the province of Ontario in Canada. So without formal notice, we dropped in their classroom on a cold winter day last year. We have winters, they're very long. And so we went there and asked them, please tell us the history of Ontario as you know it. So participants could write their story in the structure and the way they wanted, with only one rule. They had just one rule. The duration of the task was 60 minutes. That's it. So like many critics in Canada, we were curious to see whether young French Canadians were largely ignorant about their collective past, or whether their identity and education had shaped their historical consciousness. In the last 50 years, French Canada has faced a number of changes. First of all, the fragmentation of identity along provincial lines, the migration of populations from more homogeneous rural hometown to large multi-ethnic urban centers, and increased immigration, particularly from non-European countries. These complex and rapid changes have challenged the national ideals, the collective memory, and the identity of French Canadians. As a community of memory, tracing their origin back to the French explorer Jacques Cartier and colonial New France, French Canadians have always been preoccupied with their survival in North America. For French historian Michel Brunet, the conquest of 1760 by the British during the 7 Years' War transformed the French in Canada into a conquered people, which triggered an inward-looking defense mechanism that has endured ever since. Today, French Canada, living across the country, but mostly in Eastern Canada, represent roughly a quarter of Canada's population. And they continue to see themselves as a so-called founding nation of Canada, a country created in the 19th century as a federation now made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. French Canadian identity predated the creation of Canada, but French Canadians have gradually developed more territorialized identities along their province of residence. Yesterday's French Canadian, as historian Marcel Martel puts it, became Franco-Ontarian, Franco-Manitoban, and Quebecers. Historians have also made a significant contribution to this new identity process through research documenting the French presence in different provinces like Quebec, like Ontario, going as far back as Samuel de Champlain in the 17th century. They've mobilized the political and educational struggle of French Canadians against the English majority into a narrative that are deeply engraved into the collective memory. And these influences have gradually found their way into the curriculum. But as curriculum expert Larry Cubans puts it, there are important differences between what is officially mandated in the curriculum and what is learned and appropriated by students. As a result, we know as researchers very little about the tangible impact on education in general, but on schooling in particular, on students' identity and their historical consciousness. So as a researcher, key questions arise. Is French Canada and Ontario part of students' historical consciousness? Does identity affect or shape their visions of French Canada and French Ontario? Are students' narrative visions of the past in line with their schooling experience? So to answer these questions, we designed a computerized instrument based by the questionnaire that Jocelyn Letourneau used to study historical consciousness of young French Canadians in Quebec. Letourneau proposed, instead of using a survey question, to venture into the minds of learners through storytelling by asking participants to write a historical narrative, a story of their collectivity. And this approach proved to be less intimidating and significantly richer, as students were given the opportunity to offer accounts of the past that could hardly be captured with standard survey questions. So in order to examine more empirically the relationship between students' historical consciousness as found in narrative and their identity, we also asked them additional information in the form of demographics, but also in the form of identity mapping. So we, for instance, asked them to choose between different pairing circles, overlapping gradually on a continuum. So me, Canada, me, Ontario, me, French Canada. And students could pick and choose the two matching circle that best represents who they were as an individual in reference to the community. To our astonishment, the great majority of students took our surprise study very seriously. Studies from participants vary considerably, particularly between high school students and university student teachers. The former group produced significantly shorter accounts. On average, high school students wrote an account of about 106 words in 60 minutes. Teachers, on the contrary, wrote accounts of about 460 words on average. And it was on computers, so they were just typing it. Students also made greater inaccuracies, confusing dates, names, etc., and were also likely to offer what I call presentist stories. So accounts with no direct connection to the past. They were accounts dealing essentially with the present. In other words, high school students showed greater difficulty in generating a historical account compared to the student teacher. And even sometimes confessing their helplessness with catchphrases like, "Oh, honestly, sir, I don't recall anything." So we had that too. But not that many, actually. But beyond the length and limitation of the stories produced, one is struck by the similarities of all the stories in their narrative orientations, in how participants structured their story in reference to a usable past for contemporary meaning making. Both groups, the high school student and the teacher, privilege a vision of history characterized by a militant nationalist orientation known in French Canada as la survivance, the survival. And the general feature of that master narrative includes, one, an emphasis on the historic tension between French and English Canadian, with reference to traumatic events like the conquest, for example. Second element of that narrative framework, a need to fight and preserve a common heritage and language for the future of the community. And finally, an aspiration for nation building, either through self-protection or self-government. So we got about 50% of all the account very much subscribing to that narrative template. Here is, I'll show you after some quotes from the teacher. What is perhaps more interesting and novel with the research is that we were interested in correlating their stories with their sense of belonging. We wanted to see to what extent identity affected the story of the past that they produced. What we found in both groups is a strong relationship between their identity and the type of narrative they produced. In fact, I'm going to show you the results for the student teacher, the university teacher. The more participants reported the strong belonging to at least one of the three communities, so Canada, French Ontario, and Ontario, the more their narrative presented a militant orientation. And in fact, when you looked at the dominant, those who had high identifier, the dominant narrative view was that of what I call the positive militancy, which highlight the noble and glorious cause of heroic figures who fought for the French-Canadian cause. We dubbed this the just cause narrative because it provides a vision of the past based on actions seen as fundamentally right and just. Now, as Sirka was talking earlier about her experience with a victimhood, it just reminded me that if you look at the table, we also had stories of victimhoods, and these stories were produced exclusively by high identifier as well. So those who put themselves belonging very strongly to, say, for example, French Ontario, also produce those narratives of victimhood. And at the same time, which is quite interesting, those who produce stories of Canada, so the great nation building story of Canada, were very low identifier. In other words, those who presented the story that often we see publicly presented in English, Canada in particular, about this great country from coast to coast, great democratic federation. Well, those who did present that story are low identifiers. So those who did not clearly define themselves as true member of that community. Now, what's even more interesting with these is that we get the same trends with the high school student. If you look at it, we get the same thing again. Those who identified strongly with one of the three community also produce very militant stories, and the just cause being the dominant one that they chose to narrate. And at the same time, the Great Canadian Story received very little interest from high identifier students. It was mostly the low identifier who produced that kind of story. And here is an example, for example, of a high school student. This is an excerpt from their stories. He says, "What I find important in the history of Ontario is to remember those who took French language at heart. For instance, many schools in the province are named after people who fought bravely. They have changed Ontario. Many of us are not even aware of what they did to preserve our language." So not only do they talk about the need to preserve the past, but also they think that there is like an essential duty to remember what they did for today's understanding. So what can we say with these kinds of results? Well, first of all, far from being historically disconnected, our participants showed much greater relationship with the past than they cried publicly. They have a sense of chronological time, were able to structure into narrative particular visions of the past. Far from being dead, the memory of French Canada is very much alive in the stories of these kids. Now, saying this, however, is not to say that young participants have very strong, very complex forms of historical consciousness. In fact, in many ways, high school students have very traditional and fragile form of historical consciousness. For many students, la survivance remains a readily available framework still dominant in collective memory that they use as a cultural curriculum of real-life experience to structure their own accounts. French theorist Roland Barthes once characterized narrative as being without noise, because all the extraneous elements have been taken out. Students are thus more likely to remember and internalize stories which conform to or simplified their visions of the past. And as an educator, I think this creates a number of challenges. This is, many of you might be familiar with Jan Ruesen's disciplinary matrix, where he shows, for example, that disciplinary history, what we see above the line, is the kind of history that Sirka talked about earlier, which is what historians do as a profession, based on theories and established methodologies to form historically warranted account. And the hope is that these accounts would then inform practical life. And in Canada, in my province, Ontario, school history is now framed in a way that supports this disciplinary model. We talk about historical thinking. Students do historical inquiry. It's part of the curriculum, and it's also increasingly part of textbooks production and material. So the idea, the assumption with the model is that by doing this disciplinary history, This would inform, in a circular way, their practical life. But the reality that we find is that it doesn't translate easily. So what they do in the course of the classroom does not necessarily translate in the kinds of account that they tell us. And I think the lesson I want to leave you with is that notions of narrative thinking and historical consciousness are very fundamental to identity and how we make sense of the past in the form of narrative. But they're still largely absent from the education that kids receive in school. And in fact, I think this is reminding us of a crucial difference between education and schooling, between learners' social and real-life meaningful experiences and the structured and formalized learning process taking place in the school. So in conclusion, if school history is to play a significant role in shaping the education of young Canadians, it must find new ways to engage and complexify their narrative visions of the past. Failing to do so leaves students highly vulnerable to manipulation and abuses from collective memory. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank you for the great and interesting presentations to all panelists. And actually, the discussion is open now. We have just maybe 20 minutes. That's why I would like to ask for a brief questions or comments.
I think those of you who are not from Canada in the room will be tired of Canada by the time the conference is over. But I do want to challenge one of Stefan's claims in his excellent presentation on Franco-Ontarians. Just the fact that the new Ontario curriculum, which has historical thinking at the foundation of it, is only 1 year really been implemented over the past year, and the new textbooks are still coming out. So to draw a large conclusion from your interviewees' stories about Canada and the impact of schooling, I think it's too early for that conclusion.
Was this a question or a remark?
It's a question. What do you think about that?
Okay. True. It's true. I'll make a nuance here. It's true that historical thinking concepts have been integrated into the curriculum only last year as a result of a curriculum review in which I was actually involved as a reviewer. But the notion of inquiry and historical thinking predates the concept. Now we have them firmly defined in the curriculum. But if you look at the curriculum, the older one, which was implemented in 1999, they talk about historical thinking and they talk about inquiry. Now, the concepts were not defined in the way that they are now, and that's probably a good thing that they are. But I don't think it changes the thrust of the argument, which is, by the way, in Quebec, they have a new curriculum in place since 2006, correct, Jocelyn?
In reality, 7.
In reality, 7. So they've had more experience with historical thinking there than we do in Ontario. And Jocelyn collected stories in Quebec before and after the reform of the program. And he didn't find much of a difference in the accounts. And so what I'm saying here is maybe jumping the guns in that we need to do more research, obviously, across the province and longitudinal study to see the impact over time. But what we get from evidence in other research done, like in Quebec, for example, is that students don't necessarily translate what they learn in a scholastic setting into practical life. And one of the reasons for that, and this maybe you can talk more about this, Peter, is that we don't teach them narrative thinking. We don't. We don't ask students to create a narrative account of Canada. We ask them to do problem solving, inquiry-based research, to do ethical judgment, look at whether Trudeau was right or wrong to invoke the War Measure Acts. But we rarely have them create, as I did ask you at the beginning to write a full narrative account of Canada. So my sense is that, and we need to justify this empirically, is that students seems to be able to manipulate the two worlds, the world of the classroom and the classroom context, but the curricular that they get from meaningful life experience to structure their narrative of Canada.
Other questions or remarks?
You said that in Canada you are mainly doing problem solving instead of teaching a narrative history. I do assume though that students are informed or learn of official histories from other channels, and my question is, did you find any kind of competing stories when students were writing? For example, when Verge did research, he saw that people felt the need to appropriate or to choose, and they had this conflict. Did you find anything similar to your own research? Thank you.
Obviously, I mean, we don't have the tables on the screen, but they produce multiple types of accounts, and I've just talked about the dominant ones. We coded all the accounts in two ways. Globally, so was the vision of the story supporting the visions and the frameworks we have, but second, we coded each account phrase by phrase and coded each phrase. So we did an intra-narrative analysis. And what we find very interesting, and this will go back to my idea of complexifying the past that also Jocelyn talked about, is that university the student teachers, so they have all a history degree background at the university, although they tend to replicate the patterns in terms of their stories are far more complex and informed by multiple narrative views. So they talk about social history, they talk about feminism, they talk about multiculturalism and anti-racism, for example. So the university students do provide accounts with a vision and a direction, but they're informed. Internally, the structure of the story is much richer because they can bring in different lenses that the high school student, most of them don't. They provide a very linear account, which is also very linear in their structure.
Thank you. A question based on Serka, your talk, but also relevant to other talks. The notion of narrative has been used this morning and this afternoon quite a few times now. I'm wondering, Serka, you said, I think, history education and public memory is always based on narrative, and earlier it was said that remembering is always, or we live in storying and in narrative. And I'm wondering, it has been like that, but does it have to be like that? Are there ways of doing history which are non-narrative? And sort of linked to that is the question, if we lose narrative, if things are changing now, we're losing narrative, what are we gaining instead?
By narrative, I mean, in fact, that it's not like a story, simple story, like we tell stories of each other. I mean two things. That there's a kind of cause, effect, or reason, action. That kind of plot. That it's not just listing facts, so it's explaining history. That's another one. And then the other characteristic is that there is a human agent, actor, and not, let's say, structures. I often juxtapose narrative form of knowledge, let's say, with this deductive causal form of knowledge, or let's say explanation, narrative explanation and deductive causal explanation, and the latter is very typical in natural sciences. And in history, history is about human beings. So I find that it should have its own methodology. It should not be deductive causal, as it's you can't have any laws from which to deduce explanations, because there are no universal laws for human action. Social scientists try, but even they are very, very elastic, and even there has been a change and movement towards narrative form of knowledge. So you ask, what do we lose if we don't favor narratives? Was that the case?
What do we gain? If we don't, if we move from, say, narrative to something like a more parallel, messy construction, what do we gain? We perhaps lose something from narrative, but do we gain something else?
I don't see the messy presentation as the kind of alternative to narratives. I really see it's this very analytical. But this messy, yes, there are theorists who think that human life, after all, is messy, and that we should really, let's say, describe human life societies in terms of this messiness, this limitless contingency of everything. So, yeah, I fear such kind of view, because we need, looking at Ukraine, looking at everything, we need rationality and clear arguments for our doings. So, yeah, we would lose rationality, which is a very crucial human characteristic.
Maybe I can comment shortly. I'm a trained historian at the moment, and I mean, I just want to say that I think today in historical discipline and history writing there is almost no way out of narrative, because the rest is dismissed as lacking connection to social reality, and this postmodern turn is already quite old and boring to people who care about it at all in history discipline. Of course, most people don't know what's postmodern, but so in this sense, I think we would just like to construct very complicated, multi-layered, and open-ended, often perhaps, narratives.
Right. Okay, there is still place for another 2 questions from audience.
Hi, I would like to thank all presenters for the fascinating presentations, but I have questions for Stefan and Oksana, because I myself am studying history teachers as interpreters of curriculum and as interpreters of the social contexts and academic contexts and historical knowledge and so on. And so I would like to ask from Stefan, did you study history teachers too? Or did you just suppose that the curriculum is translated into the history classroom and that perhaps the teachers don't teach it at all when your curriculum? And from Oksana, I wanted to ask about the focus groups you did with teachers. What did you actually ask them, and how open the teachers were in their answers and their discussions, and how these discussions went? Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent question. As I said in the talk, there are significant differences between what is mandated in a curriculum guideline approved by the Ministry of Education and what actually goes on in a classroom when the door is closed. There are significant differences. We all know that. And actually, the curriculum encourages teachers to take the curriculum away and interpret it in their own way. It's not meant to be a prescription. There is no, in Ontario, there is no state-mandated examination at the end of the year. So we're not evaluating student or the teachers through standardized testing, at least not yet. So teachers have some flexibility in interpreting the curriculum. Now, this is kind of ironic in a way because we want teachers to be agents of transformations. But at the same time, we would like them to follow our ideas as well, particularly when we want them to do like historical thinking and so on. So it's not exactly clear how teachers translate those objectives into learning activities, lesson plans, and assessment. We do have, what I know is that we do have organizations in Canada that offer professional development to classroom teachers in the forms of professional development days, summer institute, and so on. And they do offer teachers an opportunity to interpret the curriculum in a way that I just talked about here, is to promote deeper understanding of the past through the discipline of history. But at the same time, we know also that many teachers continue to teach in very traditional ways because often this is how they've been taught. This is how they conceive of history, so this is how they also transmit it to their students. But we see the challenge and the problem with this is that when we survey the students in something like an instrument like this, using a narrative account, we see that students don't necessarily draw much on the kinds of things that they've learned in school in very explicit terms. Sometimes we know exactly that it's coming from the classroom because we could see in the story that it must have been taught in class because it would have been difficult to get it elsewhere. But at the same time, we see that what I call the cultural curriculum, so the real-life cultural experiences that they get from family discussions, from going to museums, from attending War of 1812 commemoration events, and so on, also affect very much their stories of the past. Sam Weinberg in the US wrote a piece a few years ago called Forrest Gump and the Future of History. Because he found that kids often use movies like Hollywood movies such as Forrest Gump to make sense of periods like the Vietnam War, which we know that they learn in school, but it was not the meaningful past. So maybe to go back to earlier question of that on narrative, by what we lose and what we gain. Well, by not introducing narrative in the classroom, we lose significantly because students actually gain their visions of the past in the form of stories elsewhere. And if they're not confronted in the classroom, then they just leave the school very much intact.
We lose the battle of making sense of the mess. No.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, I didn't elaborate in my presentation more about these focus groups. Just first, I wanted to comment on what Stefan said about state-mandated exams. I think this fully defines the process of history teaching in Ukraine, because as there is a state-mandated exam at the end of the school year, teachers have to follow the textbooks, the program very closely, because they will be the pupils and teachers are evaluated on the basis of what they learn as a result of this official program. So it's really obliges teachers to follow the facts, whatever is in the textbook. More broadly about the focus groups, so these were 13 focus groups held in 11 regions. Some regions had 2 focus groups, so there were 2 overarching questions. The first one was about the discussion how they teach controversial issues, and OUNUPA, of course, is one of these controversial issues. And the second one, how do they integrate stories of national minorities in teaching, so they allocate any time to alternative stories in addition to this master ethnic narrative of the Ukrainian nation. And what we saw, it's very often teachers, they just don't understand the question. For them, it's like, what's the problem with Crimean Tatars? Like, we don't see any problem. We all of us live in peace. There is no ethnic conflict whatsoever. So it's really what we saw, that even as I mentioned with Ounu Pas, it's not a problem. It's just I teach as it is in the textbook. If there are questions, I leave it to school children to figure out themselves or to make sense out of these controversial issues. But overall, these were the two core questions which were asked.
Thank you. Now I have to cut our session for a 30 minutes break. I think that I will tell you more about.
Thanks to all for this fruitful discussion. And I would like to turn your attention now to the first part of the break. It's poster coffee break. So there are a number of people from organizations or even individuals that actually apply some of the memory concepts and try to reflect upon them. And they have made a number of presentations, mostly through in the form of posters. And in the upcoming 30 minutes, they are going to be available at their posters, and they would be happy to discuss their projects with you. So it's both coffee and poster, but please bear in mind that it's also the poster one. Thank you.
Thank you.